Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Shalom Aleichem, Bruchim Habayim. Okay, I want to share with you an important point here on the Sugya, Kaihanim Shluchei Dirachmana Ninu or Shlucha Didan. The Gemara in Nedarim, Lamed Hamid Beis brings the Shaila Iboy Lahu. Hani Kaihani Shluchei Didan Hava or Shluchei Deshmaya. Are these Kaihanim our Shluchim or the Shluchim of heaven? The Gemara asks what's the nafkamina. The Gemara says the nafkamina is if the kohen is asur to give hana to the Yisrael, can the kohen do avoida for the Yisrael? If he's his shliach, then he's doing you a favor. The Ran asks the following question. If you look in the Gemara in Kedushin, the Gemara in Kedushin on Chav Gimel Amud Beis concludes as follows. The Gemara concludes, the Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna says, Braid Rabbi Yeshua, Hani Koihani Shluchid Rachmananenu. They have to be the Shluchim of Shemayim. Disakadaitach Shluchid Didan, if they're our Shliach, Nenu, Mi Ika Midi da Anan Loi Matzinon Avdina and Ve'inu Matzi Avdi. Is it possible to have something that we are not able to do and they are able to do? Quite right. In other words, we are not able to do the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash. So how can the Kohanim do it for us? So the Gemara in Kedushin, Chav Gimel Amud Beis concludes that Kohanim are shluchei dirachmana. So the Ran asks, what's the shaila over here? Afagav divid parakama de Kedushin asik Rav Huna de shluchei dirachmana ninu. Even though in Kedushin the Gemara concludes based on Rav Huna that they're the shluchei dirachmana, tisakadaitach shlucha didan, because if you're going to say there are shluchim, is there something that we are not able to do and they are able to do? Afilu hachi, nevertheless, we're asking over here, we want to be poishet the shaila from a Mishnah or a Braisa. In other words, we know logically they have to be shluchei dirachmana. Here we're asking, can we prove this from a Mishnah or a Braisa? That's the Ran in Masechta Nedarim. However, Tosafot, let me try to bring it up onto the screen. Tosafot in Kedushin says something else entirely. Tosafot in Kedushin says, I'm putting it up on the screen, in Kedushin Chav Gimel Amud Beis, Tosafot Divrei Hamaschal Dam Rav Huna, Hani Kaihani Shluchei Dirachmana Ninu. Tosafot says, Perish B'kunshus, the Meiri le'inyan hakravas hakarbanos v'nafkamina le'inyan mudar hana min ha'koyin. Someone is also to get enough from a koyin, sha'koyin mutar l'hakrav karbanosaf. Tema, question, the mashma hachad pshitale, it's mashma here that we have a conclusive conclusion. U'v'mesaches nedarim parakein bein hamudar boi hani kahani shluch d'rachmana hava shluch didan v'lo yivshita. Why does the Gemara Nedarim not bring what it says in Kedushin, the svara of Rav Huna Brei Rabbi Yeshua, that Hani Kaihani Shlucha de Rachmana Ninu? So first, Tosafot brings the same answer that the Ran says. Tosafot brings this is the Derech of Shas in many places. That does not bring, it's looking to find a proof from a Mishnah or a Braisa. Even though it could technically bring a proof from an Amayra. That's what the Ran said. However, Tosafot says something else. The Gemara Nedarim Shaila is like this. We understand Kaihane Shluchei Dirachmana Ninu. Hani Kaihane Shluchei Dirachmana Davka Ninu V'loi Shlucha Didan Klal. The Gemara Shai is like this. We know they have to be Shluchei Dirachmana because Mi Ika Midi, something that we are not able to do and they could do. But the Shaila is, very good, we know they're Shluchei Dirachmana. Are they only Shluchei Dirachmana and not our Shliach at all? Aidim Havanami Shlucha Didan. The nafkamina would be that if the kohen was also shluchei didan, he couldn't do it if he was mudar b'hanav. Nafkamina shemhaya kohen makriv shaloi l'das abaylim. The nafkamina would be if they are our shliach, then they can't do it without das. Or ishluchei derachmana Nami, let's see what the Gersa should be. Or Shluchei Derachmana. Some say it might be, you have to put in, let's see, over here on the bottom. Ulai tzarach leimer al inyan hamader hana mechasnai pasak kishmuel. In other words, the shaila is, are they only shluchei derachmana, or are they also shluchei didan? The nafkamina would be, could they do it without the das habaylam? If they're also shluchei didan, they need the das bailam. If they're not shluchei didan, then they don't need the das bailam. In other words, this answer of Tosafot is different than the Ran. The Ran says it's the same shaila. The Gemara in Kedushin has a logical conclusion, and our Gemara Nedarim wants to bring a proof from a Mishnah or a Brisa. But then Tosafot says that yes, we've already put half of the matter to rest. Namely, certainly the Kohanim are shluchei derachmana. The question is, are they also shluchei didan? And mi'ika midi only says they have to be, at least to some extent, shluchei derachmana. But it doesn't mean necessarily that they're not also shluchei didan. So this is a very big discussion over here. What exactly is this idea that maybe they're also acting on our behalf? So the Achronim ask on Tosafot that, what do you mean? The Gemara in Kedushin says you can't say they're shluchei didan because of mi'ika midi. If there are shliach, how could they be our shliach in any capacity whatsoever to do something that we ourselves are not able to do? I mean, in other words, Tosafot's kasha is, the Gemara in Kedushin comes to a conclusion. They have to be working for heaven. If they're working for us, how could they do something for us that we ourselves can't do? So what's the answer? The question is, could they also be working for us? How could they also be working for us to do something that we ourselves can't do? So this is where Rabbi Elchonon comes in. He says something astounding. Let's see if we could figure it out. This is in Rabbi Elchonon. Rabbi Elchonon is found in Kovetz Ha'aros. Kovetz Ha'aros, Siman Ayin Vav, Ois Yud Zayin. Now, it's interesting, there are not that many simanim in the Kovetz Ha'aros. The last siman is siman pei. So this is really toward the end of Rabbi Elchonon. Rabbi Elchonon brings the Gemara in Kedushin. He brings the Gemara in Kedushin's conclusion, mi'ika midi. He brings Tosafot's kasha that in Nedarim we don't have a shaila. Why? In Nedarim we have a shaila, we don't have a conclusion. Why doesn't it bring the conclusion of Kedushin? And Tosafot in Yuma, I guess, I don't know why he doesn't bring Tosafot in Kedushin, answers that we definitely know they're shluchei derachmana. The shaila is maybe they're also shluchei didan b'miktsas. To which Rabbi Elchonon asks, you could still ask, mi'ika midi, on that miktsas shlichus. So says Rabbi Elchonon, based on a principle that he advanced earlier, he says, the yesh shnei minei shlichus. There are two types of agencies. Namely, heicha de beloy hashlichus, where without the shlichus loy mahani hamasa, the act wouldn't help. The tzarch shameshalech yimsar koichoy lashliach, the mishalech has to give himself over to the shliach. In other words, the mishalech needs to invest the power that he has in the shliach. And regarding this mechanism, we say something that the shliach, that the person themselves can't do, how could the shliach do? Okay. In other words, when the mishaleach needs to invest his whole essence into the shliach, this will only work if the mishaleach himself could do it. That's when we say mi'ika midi. Rabbi Elchonon says there are two kinds of shliach. One is the mishaleach gives over to the shliach his capacity. Let's say to marry a woman. The mishaleach gives over to the shliach the mishaleach's capacity to marry the woman, and the shliach acts on his behalf. In that case we say, mi ika midi, how can I do something for you that you yourself can't do? That's by the kind of shlichus that I need to give over to you my capacity. But what if I don't have to give over my capacity to you? What if we only have to attribute a certain act to the mishaleach? In other words, the shliach does the act, and the Torah is mechadesh that the maisa is miyuchas to the mishaleach. Says Rabbi Chanan, where the shliach could do it himself. But the shlichus needs that the maisa is attributed to the mishaleach. For this, we don't apply the rule to call milsa di'u loy matzi, that if I can't do it myself, if the mishaleach can't do it himself, the shliach can't do it for him. V'zeu kavanas taisus. The amrinon shluchei didan davka v'loy shluchei drachmana klal. If we say that you're just my shliach and you're not working for heaven at all, so then what does that mean you're not working for heaven? What are you doing? So the answer is, I need to invest you with a certain capacity over here. Well, I can't invest you with a capacity if I myself can't do it. If it's just shluchei didan, then the shlichus is needed to certify the avodah. The im yakriv hakoyin below shlichus habalim, that if the koyin is makriv without the shlichus of the balim, ha-carbon pasal, the carbon is pasal k'mavur b'divrei sham. In other words, if we assume that kohanim are shluchei didan and they're acting for us, that means their only capacity here is through the Yisraelim. So the problem then is, how could they be invested with the power to act if the Yisraelim themselves can't do it? So therefore the Gemara in Kedushin says, mi ika midi, and the Gemara concludes, they must be acting for heaven. But now that they're acting for heaven, now we have another shaila. The shaila is, okay, they're working on behalf of heaven. So heaven has invested them with the capacity. But we still need to attribute the act back to the Yisrael, don't we? If they're also our agents, we don't need them to act as an agent to make the carbon kosher, because it's a kosher carbon. Heaven ratified them. All we need them to do is attribute the act to the Yisrael. For that we don't say mi ika midi didan, that the maisa is nechshav to the mishameach, like when we say by Dvar Avera. So that we don't care about a loy matzi avid. I think we can explain it very clearly. We start with the Gemara in Kedushin. The Gemara in Kedushin wants to know, their kohanim are bringing karbanos in the Beis HaMikdash. Who exactly is giving them the ability to bring a carbon? Who are they? What's a kohen? It's not like this kohen has to bring a carbon. He didn't do an avera. He didn't make a neder. What's he doing in the mikdash? The shaila is, are they invested with power from heaven, or are they invested with power from the person who appointed them? So the Gemara says, who invests them with power? It has to be heaven. It can't be the person who's chayav to bring the carbon, because the person who's chayav to bring the carbon can't invest them with the power that the person themselves doesn't have. The person who has to bring the carbon can't bring the carbon. So if he can't bring the carbon, he can't invest them with power. So what makes a kohen eligible to go to a Beis HaMikdash and bring a carbon is heaven. Okay. Now the question is, does that carbon need to be attributable back to the Yisrael, that it should be considered like the Yisrael brought it? Or do we not need that? Do we not need to attribute it back to the Yisrael? The Kohen brings it. it doesn't have to be considered like the Yisrael brought it. As long as somehow the Yisrael made sure it was brought, it doesn't have to be considered that the Yisrael brought it. So now we're no longer dealing with the question of who invested the kohen with the ability to bring a carbon. If that was the question, the Gemara in Kedushin already dealt with that question. The Gemara in Kedushin says, who invested the kohen? It has to be heaven. It can't be the Yisrael. The Yisrael doesn't have the power to invest in the kohen. But now the shaila is it critical that when the kohen brings the carbon, we could say it's being brought on behalf of the Yisrael, that the carbon is attributable back to the Yisrael? So that's a shaila. What's the nafkamina? The nafkamina would be whether the Yisrael is mudar hana from the kohen. The nafkamina would be, would you need the das of the kohen? But we wouldn't now say, mi ika midi, that the Yisrael can't do and the kohen could do. Sure there is, because the reason the kohen could do it is because God invested him with the power. There's only one limited question now. Do they need to attribute it back to the Yisrael? Regarding the second element of Shlichus, we will not apply mi ika midi. Is there something that the Mishaleach could do that the Shliach can't do? That's only regarding if they're needed, if we need to understand what gives the Shliach the ability to act. We don't have a problem. What gives the Shliach and the Kohen the ability to act? Heaven gives them the ability to act. The limited question is, do we need to attribute that act back to the Yisrael? That's the shaila in Nedarim, whether Kohanim are only Shluchei Drachmana, or are they also Shluchei Didan? We ask, well, if there's an element of Shluchei Didan, then how can they do it for the Yisrael who couldn't do it himself? No, that's only a problem when we're dealing with the element of Shlichus, where I need to invest you with power. You've already been invested with power from heaven. Now all that's needed is we need to attribute it back to the Yisrael. Regarding that, Rabbi Elchonon says we do not apply the problem of the Gemara in Kedushin, mi ika midi, that the Mishaleach cannot do and the Shliach could do. Yeah? That's what we got today. That's Rabbi Elchonon's explanation for Tosafot in Kedushin. Apparently it's also a Tosafot in Yuma. So there are two sugyas in Shas. Kedushin is dealing what fuels the ability of a kohen to act in the mikdash. That, heaven. Masechta Nedarim deals with, okay, does that need to be attributed in any way to the Yisrael? That's the shaila. By the way, the Gemara Nedarim seems to have a very strong tzad that no, kohanim are in fact shluchei didan, and they are attributing back to the Yisrael, and the only carbon they could do by mudar hana is mechusare kapara, because you don't need das. So the Gemara seems to be saying that even though what fuels the kohanim's ability is what the Gemara in Kedushin says rachmana, there is still an element of also shluchei didan. Have an amazing day, everyone. If you find yourself near Cedarhurst, our shul Machon is having an annual barbecue, dinner, campaign launch, and everyone's cordially welcome and invited. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone. Kol tov.